to the point where, you kind of almost sort of inherit your Turkishness, right? But it's also not necessarily genealogical, right? So that's why. Because if there were like a Turkic race, Turks wouldn't be a part of it. So that's why we don't really think of it that way. We think of it more as an ethnonym. Okay. So I'll show you examples of all this. First of all, language. Where are Turkic languages spoken in the world? So here's a map that shows the dark lines here are modern day countries. This is a present day map. And then the colors are these different languages that are spoken. And they're also clustered into like subfamilies. And within the subfamilies, there's even more mutual intelligibility. But across all of them, there's a pretty good degree of mutual intelligibility. You notice that it's mostly in Central Asia. So most of the areas that we see. And actually, these countries here are countries where the official language is some Turkic language. But all these countries were also actually former states of the Soviet Union. And prior to that, they were maybe their own country or maybe like a loose federation collection of regions. But they sort of always maintained like a particular cultural identity, a language and whatnot. And so these borders are borders that make sense traditionally, right? But a lot of these people here speak like Russian as a second language, for example. We also have like these pockets up here of these various concentrations of people speaking Turkic languages. And that's the reason for that is actually this is a state in Russia where the official language is a Turkic language. And so there's a few of those. There's a few like states within Russia that are essentially autonomous regions where the people that live and run the government are all the same collection of Turks and speak that language. And so that's the official language of the government. We have some autonomous regions here in China. And then the one we're focusing on for our cultural celebration is Turkey right here. This is Turkey. And the language that's spoken there is Turkche, which is just the most commonly spoken Turkic language. Okay. I want to highlight a few other groups here for comparison, for talking about the interesting significance of the spread of the language. So one of the states in Russia that has Turkic language as like its official language is the Sakha Republic in Siberia. And so the language spoken there is Sakha, also called Yakut. And it's a Turkic language, and they are Turkic people. And this one is interesting in particular because of its isolation. It's sort of far off the map. And you notice that there's this white space in between. Part of that is because there's not a lot of people living there. The other part is that the people that are living there don't speak a Turkic language. And so what happened was that there was sort of this spread where either Turks left from Asia to go to Siberia or the other way around. And we're not really sure. But then there was like this lack of communication between them because these groups were each having their nomadic cycles and not really crossing over, because the trek to cross over from Siberia to Central Asia was very treacherous. And so then you sort of get in Siberia your own little nomadic populations. And so what this means is that there was this opportunity for the language and the culture to sort of divert a lot, right? And what's interesting is that given the opportunity for it to be very diverse from the rest, it's kind of not. There still is a lot of mutual intelligibility, even though there was a lot of opportunity for that to change. Also, the cultural similarity is very, very similar, even though it had the opportunity to change. Another group that's worth talking about because of modern contemporary issues are the Uyghurs in China. So they have their own autonomous region and they speak a Turkic language. Uyghur is a Turkic language and they have Turkic culture. So before I move on to the next slide, I want to go back to this connection here sort of between Sakha Republic and Turkey to sort of draw attention to how big this space is. Because when you're looking at Central Asia on a 2D map, it often distorts how huge this actually is. So the population center of Turkey is around here in Istanbul. And the population center of the Sakha Republic is Yakutsk, which is somewhere around here. And the distance between those two cities is more than 6,300 miles, which is enormous. For context, that is longer, so a larger distance than the distance between England and Japan. Like England and Japan are closer to each other than the population center of Turkey and the population center of the Sakha Republic. So going back to the example of like England and India, like so the distance between England and India is less than the distance between Istanbul and the Yakutsk. And that is a particularly interesting comparison here because if you think about Hindi, like I mentioned before, Hindi and English have like zero mutual intelligibility. And you might be like, oh, well, it's because they're very far away from each other. Well, so is Istanbul and Yakutsk, but the languages there are still pretty mutually intelligible. And you might say like, oh, well, you know, in Hindi and English are just really different languages. Yeah, but they're in the same language family. They're both Indo-European languages. So it's just an interesting comparison because we can say, hey, here's some other you know, language family where you can look at things that are far away from each other and they have really low mutual intelligibility. But within the sphere of Turkic languages, the opposite ends of the map here still have a large degree of mutual intelligibility, even when there was this lack of back and forth traveling for, you know, like 1,000 years. So there's an opportunity for there to be this big change, but there wasn't. So it's interesting that that happened. Okay. So that's language. Let's talk about like cultural similarities. So here's a woman in a Uyghur traditional dress. Now, I can't tell you this explicitly, but I have reason to believe that this is actually related to a wedding. And I'll explain that in a little bit. But so if you just Google like Uyghur traditional dress, you'll find things that look like this, but maybe have different colors, like bright red, bright yellow, pink, green, blue. But if you add wedding to that, you'll start to see things that are mostly red. And so I couldn't find anything that explicitly said that this was a wedding dress. But again, I had reason to believe this was related to a wedding. So let's talk about some of the features here, right? We see that the edges of things have like this gold stitching, usually with like some circular pattern to it, you know, like very embellished. Also stitching to resemble flowers. You know, there is a preference for like sort of circular patterns. We see up here that there's actually just a circular disc on the hat. And then the veil also has these rectangular strips going down that are metallic with sort of like circular patterns and stitching, and the bright red, very vibrant, right? Also with undertones of white. Compare this to a Saka traditional dress. Again, I have reason for believing that this has to do with a wedding, but I couldn't find that explicitly stated in the photo. But see the similarities here, right? We also have a head garb with a veil, and we have like the rectangular draping down the side that has you know, metallic circular stitching patterns. Here they're beads. The edges of the garment have like this really embellished you know, gold stitching with like flower stitching patterns and circular patterns that show up. And again, you know, like if you just look for more pictures of Uyghur dress, you might find things that have a hat that look like this, but with less fur. The addition of fur is something that is included in Saka dress, which makes sense because they're in Siberia, right? So very similar. Now compare this to Turkey. So here we have a woman in a traditional kına gecesi dress, which is related to a wedding. And so there's this tradition in Turkey called the henna night. And it's like a bachelorette party, sort of, except that it's more focused for the family members, the women family members on both sides. And it's like a bittersweet ceremony because the idea is that everybody is happy for the bride to be married, but also sad that the bride is leaving the family household, because in Turkish culture, I can at least say this is true in Turkey, people just live with their family until they get married. It's not like, oh, when you're 18, you're on your own. You stay a family until you get married. Like that is the transitionary thing. And the family unit in Turkey is much, much stronger than it is here in the US. With all the Turks that you've met over these past few days, if you were to ask them, do you miss your family? They'd start crying. You know, it's really, really tight. And so that's why it's bittersweet, because it's like, it's happy that she's getting married, but also sad that she's leaving the family, right? And to start her own. But so let's look at the similarities here, right? We see that there's the veil, there's the floral circular patterns. The edges of things have that gold band stitching that where if you zoom in, you see the like little small circular flowers, flower stitching, very embellished gold with undertones of white, right? Over here also with the Saka dress, undertones of white. And so the reason why I can tell you explicitly that this henna night dress has to do with a wedding, and the reason why I believe the others have to do with the wedding is because this is actually my wife. So I have explicit knowledge about that because that's my wife. And so I know about this tradition and how it works. And so I had reason to believe that I would find pictures like this if I were to look at traditional wedding dresses for other Turkic cultures. And you see the incredible similarities. And what's really incredible here is that these are sort of like the fringe edges of that map of Turkic speaking people, right? And so they're on the absolute edges. The distance between this culture and this culture is more than 6,300 miles. And yet look at the similarities that we can notice here with these traditions that are also pretty similar. So I just chose this as an example because I had some nice pictures about it, but pretty much like any cultural thing, you can draw that comparison, right? Yes, to people in the chat who are saying my wife is beautiful, I know, I am aware, and I'm very, very proud of her. She's actually the speaker later today too. She's going to talk a lot about women in Turkey and inspiring women in Turkey. Okay, so let's move on to where did Turkic people originate from? Because this is interesting. When you look at that map of Turkic-speaking peoples, it's large, right? So how did that spread happen? So I apologize for the poor resolution of this map. It's just, it was a pretty good map. It just was the wrong size. So it's from a Turkish textbook, and it's showing about how Turks migrated out of Central Asia, starting roughly around 500 AD, roughly through 1500 AD, in various like waves. And the reason for this migration outwards was because, within this region, they'd have like migratory routes that they sort of follow. They'd sort of do this loop, and but the sort of predominant form of government at the time was the Khanate. And so a Khanate is like a mixture of an empire and nomadism. So there's like some origin point where a culture will have some particular leader that's like really charismatic and can unify and then like conquer and spread outwards. And so there's like the center, the capital. But I mean, imagine what a capital looks like for nomadic people. Like what exactly is that? So the capital really is actually like a region where within that region, people are having this little small migratory pattern. But this sort of just spreads outwards and expands all on horseback. So it's very fast. And within like 1 or 2 generations, all of Asia might be conquered by some particular Khanate. And then the next generation, it would just disappear. And so this would happen again and again over a period of like 1,000 years. Okay. And so that's why we get these waves that move out. Sometimes a wave that might move out might have been a Khanate trying to conquer more, but other times it was just a group of Turks that were leaving because of the Khanate expansion. They said, we don't want to be a part of this, right? So you get lots of Turks that come in with this fearsome reputation of being like conquerors. Then you also have ones that are just like fleeing. They're like refugees, sort of, right? And so the earliest Turkic people sort of moved here into Europe and sort of formed Bulgaria a little bit. It had some influences there. And then, we move into Anatolia. That's another migration that happens up into Siberia, down into India, over into China and whatnot. And so we can sort of trace this backwards to like the Altai region of Central Asia. But the thing is, interestingly, there's lots of question marks here about various gaps. But then also when we sort of go back to that origin point where we say, okay, this is where sort of like they started, there's this interesting question of like what happened before that. Were they always there, or did they come later, right? And then start at that point. So we don't really know. Now, it's interesting. If you let me rephrase some of the information that we have talked about today, right? There's this group of people called Turkic peoples that comprises 200 million people. The space of the earth that is covered by these Turkic-speaking peoples is a giant landmass that's somewhere between 5 and 10% of the landmass of the world. So giant spread, really rich culture, all very similar, their own language family. And yet probably you're learning about this kind of for the first time right now, or learning about this culture for the first time in the past few days. And so that itself is an interesting question. Like, why does this seem like such a big deal that you know so little about? And so if you sort of dig to try to understand why there are those gaps, it opens up a whole collection of interesting questions, which have either, they're unanswered questions, or the answer is very tragic. So let's talk about that. Why is there this gap in knowledge? So one, the nomadic lifestyle makes tracing origins difficult. When you look at what archaeologists do to sort of map out how some cultures came or evolved from others, you look for periods of time where there's some big migration. But the problem is that was literally always happening for Turkic culture, right? It's always moving. If you think about what archaeologist does as work, like the heavy work is at places where there's migration. So just that's like always happening. Like if you're an archaeologist trying to study this, there's just more work. So that's one thing. Sort of related to this, Turkic nomadic lifestyle, the Khanate form of government contributed to the sort of like grayness of this identity or like Turkic label, right? We're not even really sure if there was like originally some Turkic ethnicity, like if there was a group of people that like started off this whole collection of people called Turks, right? It might have actually really just been a bunch of different tribes that merged over time because of this phenomena called Turkification. So every culture has this feature where proximity to other cultures causes cultural blending. That's just how culture works. But with Turkic culture, it kind of happens more intensely. And that's, we call this Turkification. It has a larger tendency to cause nearby cultures to become more Turkic. And this is sort of like the mathematician way of explaining this, especially like the type of math that I do. How I think about this is a very math kind of way. But imagine you have like a little tub of water and you drop blue water, like color food dye into like some particular spot. And then it has this ripple effect and it starts to spread blue in a particular direct, like a circular pattern outwards, where the further away you get from the drop, the less blue it gets. This is sort of like the idea of a khanate spreading its culture. Okay, it's most centered at one particular point. So the darker the blue, the more culture of that particular group you have. And then as you spread out, it gets less and less of a percentage of that culture, right? Now imagine you have like red dye that you drop somewhere else. That also spreads out. And then you get this purple mix, right? And then let's say you drop a green dye in that purple mix. Then what happens, you get like this brown that spreads outwards. And everything is just becoming more and more brown, right? And that's, if you think about it, if you just allow this to happen over and over, eventually the entire tub is just like this brown color. And that's sort of like what Turkification is. The idea is that there's this merging of things that happens. And when you have these cultures that sort of spread out and then conquer other cultures and say, hey, we're moving this direction, this is the language you speak now, this is the stuff that we do. The stuff that kind of sticks is the stuff that's in common. And the stuff that has the tendency to be really like, quote unquote, catchy, right? So, you know, what it means is that the collection of things that make up Turkic culture are things that are easy to adapt and identify with. So, or at least that's my understanding of this. That's my mathematical explanation of this. Like I said, I'm not like an archaeologist or anything, but it also, I mean, it explains my relationship with Turkic culture, right? Like I feel like I'm Turkish now just by my proximity to Turkish people, right? And I feel such an identity with it just by proximity, right? And so the reason I bring this up is because this is sort of an explanation for how there might not have really been an original Turkic ethnicity. It's just actually like a confederation of people that collectively sort of converged. The other thing is Turkic history is carried by oral tradition. Like they didn't write things down for a really long time. It was all oral. And so this, of course, gives a tendency for it to become more and more story-like, more and more embellished and becoming mythological. And so then this makes like, you know, verifying things a little bit more difficult because there's that mythology that's imbued with it, right? So a classic example of this is the like the legend of Oğuz Khan, the supposed original Turk Khan. And he like fought off a dragon and then like communicated with the sky god and then commanded an army of wolves and like lots of things that are, you know, embellished. But part of the myth is that he had 6 sons that spread and started 6 tribes. And we know about the names of those 6 tribes. And like, that's a pretty verifiable fact. So it makes like everything a little hazy, right? Another thing is this, like I mentioned, 40% of all Turkic speaking people are from Turkey, right? So the Anatolian Turks that formed the Ottoman Empire, their culture dramatically changed over time because they became cosmopolitan, right? They just imbued all these cultures together. And so you have this giant chunk of Turkic peoples that become over time something kind of different. But now in the turn of the 20th century, there was this collective conscious effort among the Turkish people in the Ottoman Empire to sort of rediscover their original Turkish roots and sort of Turkify themselves. And there was a lot of success with that, which ultimately, you know, people in Turkey, I think is a very good thing, right? And so, you know, the examples I showed you here was sort of like unintentional loss of culture, right? Or these missing pieces. It's sort of unintentional. And the last point here is actually kind of intentional, which is the persecution of sort of Turkic cultural leaders in the Soviet era. And so Turkology is like just general description of like a few different intellectual endeavors, like historians who study specifically Turkish history, or archaeologists who study specifically, you know, Turkish origins, and language professors who speak Turkish and teach Turkish. that sort of intelligista was persecuted and imprisoned. And more extreme cases, the religious leaders of these sort of like pagan kind of Turks in Siberia, the religious leaders were executed. So there was a lot of intentional destruction of Turkish culture during the Soviet rule. And that ripple effect is felt, but a sort of positive thing that's going on now is there's like a sort of collective effort to try to rediscover those roots in particular in sort of the Central Asian countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union, to sort of rediscover those Turkic origins, right? So even with all of those things causing there to be a loss of knowledge, we do have some known general facts. So here's some known facts. We do understand the original homeland to be essentially the Altai region of Central Asia. We can confidently place Turks there around 2200 BC, but there's the common theory right now is that it was probably like 3000 BC that they got there, but they might have always been there. They might have came to there from some other place. We're not really sure. Turkic language, we can date as far back as 600 BC, but details about that sort of moment in history where we can place that language, like the details of the context about like what that language was kind of implying that it had been around for longer. But this is just the earliest record that we can find of that. And what's really interesting here is that there's a more than a 1,000-year gap between the earliest identified existence of Turkic language and the earliest identified existence of Turkic script.